Hello, I'm here with Deb Liu, the Chief Executive Officer of Ancestry. Deb, thanks for joining us today to talk about sort of diversity and innovation from your perch over in Silicon Valley. You know what? I'm going to just turn it over to you right away and let you introduce yourself to the audience. And, I could talk about how you got a BS in civil engineering from Duke University and an MBA from Stanford Business School. But, I'll let you fill in the blanks and give it a little personal flavor as to who you are and why you're here.
I started my career in Silicon Valley about 18 years ago, actually at a startup with a few hundred people called PayPal. And I went on to lead the buyer experience at eBay. And then I started at Facebook almost 11 years ago. Had an interesting career there, leading a number of different initiatives, games, payments, platform, eventually built Facebook Marketplace, which hit 1 billion people recently. And a few months ago, I actually started as the new CEO of Ancestry, a company that's been around for over 3 decades. And so it's been an incredible journey to come here. And I look forward to talking more about diversity and bringing more diversity to all the things that we do in Silicon Valley.
Well, Deb, it's an honor to be here talking to you today. I see you probably have about over, close to 2 decades of experience in Silicon Valley in tech. So that's good. When I was growing up in Brooklyn, they would have thrown me out of Zoom meetings like this if there was Zoom. So I'm happy to be here and talk to you about diversity. And it's funny, I think about Ancestry, and we're going to get into sort of what diversity means in a second, but I would imagine that the product itself is probably sort of I guess, ironically, doing some good in the diversity world when people get their results and not realizing how diverse their background is, right? So sometimes I'm sure you get some phone calls say this can't be right.
A lot of ways, we're more diverse than we think we are. So a lot of people who try Ancestry DNA find that their experience shares that they're coming from different parts of the world than they ever imagined. One of the things people kind of have this fixed idea of the stories that their parents or grandparents tell them, but actually we are a people that have migrated around the world. And what's incredible is just finding the stories that are embedded in your DNA. And that's what we do. We also allow people to craft and connect around their family story. So really kind of discover the documents. For example, I discovered my mother-in-law's immigration papers recently. And it's just really incredible to see kind of her signature, which looks, by the way, exactly the same, from 30 something, 40 years ago. And it's incredible to see kind of the journey that brought somebody from another country here and how that adds to the fabric of what makes America special.
Yeah, and I think a lot of folks are probably learning what the word diaspora finally means, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so on the topic of diversity, so Deb, tell me, tell the audience, it means different things to different people. It's probably meant different things during different political eras or different, periods that we are in American society. But personally, what does diversity mean to you?
Well, diversity is really, if you think about what it is, it's really embracing all of the experiences that we bring to the table. And I think sometimes we have this fixed idea of what diversity means, but it's really bringing all ideas to the table from all over the world, as we talked about with Ancestry DNA, but also the experiences that people have, not just where you're from, which is a kind of what, but also how you got there, the experiences that you bring to the table. How do you think about things differently? And how do we actually bring that level of representation? So people who represent different communities, ethnic communities, as well as experiences. So, and also like life experiences. People who, for example, from the LGBTQ community have a very different perspective on a product. And we really need to think about how that comes to life in our products themselves.
Okay, so then I think then that's probably what some people nowadays are referring to, sort of cognitive diversity, right? People from different experiences, from different schools. So not everybody on your team went to the same, not everybody went to Stanford and studied from the same professors using the same textbooks. So how has that shaped sort of like, so that's your personal view of diversity. And what have you done to sort of, give that meaning within this context of your new role at Ancestry?
Well, there's both cognitive diversity, which is experience, but there's also representation, which is important too. Seeing people who are like you in the product, seeing people who are like you leading or thinking about the product. is also incredibly important. And so, it's not just, ideas people bring to the table, but people want to see women in leadership. For example, if you're kind of a little girl, exploring the future, seeing women as CEOs will give you more inspiration to pursue that. Seeing people of diverse races and ethnicities and heritages at the table will encourage you to actually, force yourself to really think about what diversity really means. And so I do think it's both the cognitive diversity, which a lot of people talk about, but also representation is also important as you think about your product and you think about teams, so that you're forcing teams to really think about, hey, what communities are not represented here? How can we think about building better products together?
Okay, but then, all right, so let me just ask a follow-up question. Some skeptics would say, look, yeah, you're talking about diversity and that's all feel good, right? But, you're in Silicon Valley, you're running a major corporation. How does that translate to dollars and cents? Like, why should I, as a corporate executive, care?
Well, diverse teams build better products. Study after study say that having more, for example, women and minorities on boards actually outperform boards that don't have diversity. That teams are more diverse, are more creative and able to deliver better. And so, we think about diversity as this thing where it's a check the box. This is like an absolute good. We just should check the box. But when you unpack what diversity really means, is it's forcing us to really think about things differently, looking at things from different angles, bringing people who have different opinions together. It's easy to fall into groupthink. And a lot of studies have said, like, people who are very similar kind of fall into groupthink unintentionally, regardless of what those people are like. Instead, when you are across the table with someone very different from you, you actually present better points. You actually speak more and more deeply about your experience. You share more. And actually that results in better products and better outcomes.
Okay, so you mentioned sort of like avoiding the groupthink and better products and translating to dollars and cents. So, tell me from a personal standpoint, I know that you've been an inventor on patents and patent applications, at your time at Facebook and PayPal and eBay. What was your experience, sort of being, an Asian woman within that context, which I assume, that there weren't many people that looked like you or, from a gender or ethnic perspective. What were your, personal experiences being sort of an inventor in that environment?
Well, what's interesting is I grew up in a small town in the South, and I was kind of the other, right? Somebody who's really different than people around me. So South Carolina at the time was less than 1% Asian, and that was commented on tremendously. When I came to Silicon Valley, it was a revelation. I never thought I would be an inventor, because I thought inventors were scientists with beakers and test tubes, and that's what real science was. But if you actually look at a lot of the innovation happening in tech, it's really pushing the forefront of where we can go with technology to automate things, to make people's lives easier, to actually make better recommendations, connect communities in different ways. And, seeing myself as an inventor was just not something I ever thought of. And I think especially in minority communities, we just, it wasn't a thing that when I was growing up, I thought, and I imagined, and they've asked children, like, what does a scientist or inventor look like? And usually they think a man, for example, or someone who works in science. And actually, I think it's really about envisioning invention in a different way, which is it's about creativity, but it's also about, how are you improving things in the world? And I think if you ask, different communities, well, how would you want to improve the world? They have tons of ideas. But if you ask, well, have you imagined yourself on a patent? I would say that they probably have not. And so it's really about changing my mindset. When I first, I was thinking, why would I write a patent for something that seems really obvious to me? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it was a different way of doing something that we were working on at the time. And so as you think about, a lot of communities just don't have this kind of natural bent towards, okay, I think we're going to raise a generation of inventors who are going to patent a number of things. I just imagine that if I were going to go that route, I would go the hard science route. And instead, I went a very, very different path.
Okay. So can you share with the audience, I guess, maybe some, personal anecdotes that you faced or that shaped your views on diversity now, before you were, leading Facebook Marketplace or before you were CEO of Ancestry, when you were coming up the ranks as a rank and file on the product teams, any personal experiences, anecdotes that has really shaped your views on diversity today?
Well, I think, people build products that they can see, but often if you're in the minority, you don't, you see something different than other people see. I remember when I was actually at PayPal, I talked to Facebook about accepting payments which now Facebook Pay just launched offsite, which is incredible. But it was something which later, many years later, a decade later, I actually went to Facebook and built it, right? But I imagine that, social commerce payments, social commerce shopping was going to be a big thing. And actually, those are patents I submitted at PayPal when I was there, because I could envision a world where social commerce was going to be incredible. And I created the social commerce and charitable donations team, then the verticals at PayPal. But, I was one person and an individual contributor. Eventually I had a team of 3 people. We had created all of these ideas and we patented a number of them. And, slowly we were able to build out the seeds of that. Eventually I actually went to Facebook and built a lot of those things myself, partnering with companies like PayPal. But it was such an incredible journey to see it come full circle.
Okay. So, speaking of coming full circle, so now we've sort of been in a over a year now when the sort of diversity issues are quote unquote hot, right? It all started, I guess, in ground zero in Minnesota, and the social awakening, teams changing their names. Diversity is sort of being hot right now. How do we take that and capitalize on that hotness and actually institute real change? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I think for so many years, we just weren't even having the conversation, right? So the conversation was happening in the minority communities, but they were not actually happening at the levels where people were making decisions. And now that conversation is wide open, where companies are hearing employees saying, look, this is important. They're hearing users saying, hey, this is important to us. And I think this is the time for us to really open up that conversation and say, okay, how do we go from conversation to action? What are the things we're asking people to commit to? And, I think before it was kind of this quiet, well, if we can get someone to pay attention. Well, now that all eyes are on this, how do we actually amplify that? How do you continue the momentum? Because one thing that I worry about is that, change happens in fits and starts. And, you think, okay, it's done, and it's not. So you make progress, and then, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but you have to keep marching forward. And I think each time one of these instances happened, people have a conversation and then it kind of goes back to normal. But when is it going to actually take us forward? When is each conversation going to take us 2 steps forward, knowing it's going to slide back a little bit, and really kind of pushing on how are the gains going to be locked in? How are we going to get companies to really talk about diversity as a business imperative, not just as something that's kind of part of the social responsibility work? And how do you make it as part, embedded in actually the business goals? Because when people, they're doing well, a company's doing well, it's like, great, we'll do some social responsibility, we'll work on environmental things, we'll care about social justice. But when the company's doing poorly, like, okay, those things are extraneous, let's go focus on our business. But they're always focused on their business. So how do you make diversity important and imperative for business? How do you prove to businesses that this is actually going to make your bottom line better, not just kind of a check the box, we've done these things?
Okay, so I'm a corporate executive, or I lead a major law firm, or I'm somewhere in the tech ecosystem, and I'm concerned about diversity and innovation. And, and I know I recently read, I think, a study that said, if we got more minority and women inventors, the US GDP would quadruple, and, and science and technology would actually advance because of the different perspectives, as you mentioned. So I'm a corporate executive, I'm interested in this. So Deb, tell me, I have the conversation. What do I do next? Like, it can't be, I'm going to go out and hire a VP of diversity. I'm done, right?
I think that's the challenge, which is it's too easy to say, well, I have a chief diversity officer or a DI team, and they're going to take care of this. And no, it actually has
$20 in the budget.
And the thing is, it has to really be embedded in how you do things. If things are on the side, it's not going to make a difference. But, if you actually embed it in the business, you tell each executive, this is an imperative. This will make your bottom line better. This will actually, and I think the challenge is that, people, they're skeptics, but a lot of people believe, they just don't know how. I think most people don't need to be sold that, oh yeah, diversity sounds great, but they don't have any idea what are the tools of how. What does it really mean? And so really kind of getting beyond the, hey, we need more diverse people. Congratulations, we have a DEI VP. Like, great, let's move on and say, okay, here's how. I'll give you an example. So the Rooney Rule, a diverse slate, right? When we implement diverse slate, we have more diverse leaders. Now, it's the same thing when there was a study where they said, women who were playing in orchestras weren't getting the seats. So they would be temporary players in the orchestra, but they weren't getting the seats. So whenever they would audition, they would just, pick men way more than women. So then they implemented putting a screen up and listening to the music, because you would think music's objective. So looking at a woman playing, a violin versus a man would be equally, stimulating if the music were equally good. But by putting up the screen, they hired multiples more women as part of the orchestra. But you tell me whether the music was the same or not. But what we were seeing and what we were hearing were different things. But actually having a tool that says, you know what, there's bias in the system and we understand that. Let's kind of inoculate you. It's a vaccine against this kind of unconscious bias. And suddenly the screen made a huge difference. And the music sounds exactly the same. And so one of the things that we need to think about is, what are the things we need to do to inoculate our organizations? What are the tools we need to give them to say, okay, if we do diverse slate, you're not guaranteed to hire more diverse people, but you're forcing yourself to look outside your current networks, to actually interview people who are not like the people you would have normally picked. By the way, one last thing is, I often hear this in companies. It's like, I would hire more diverse people, but I wouldn't want to lower the bar. And that saying makes me insane. And I said, well, that's because if you say that, you don't understand statistics. Because unless every diverse person in America that's eligible for your job is by definition worse than every other person you could hire, you are not lowering the bar. You're actually opening up to new pools of people you had not envisioned before. And thus, having a larger pool, you're able to find even better candidates. And so often we have this fixed idea in our mind that diversity is actually lowering the bar, or it's really hard. But instead, it's really, what are the tools? What are the processes? What are the tools we're putting in the hands of the people who are going to make the difference in the business? And how do we enable that? And I think sometimes it's too easy to say, okay, we checked the boxes, we did the work. But actually, then it's really looking at outcomes. Are we making a difference? Are we progressing? And this is not about guaranteeing certain hires. It's really about, are we really progressing? Are we saying, hey, we double checked ourselves and we made so many exceptions to the diverse slate that it's not making a difference? What if we did 100% compliance? Is that going to make a difference? What if we actually looked at, amplifying in certain communities? What if we got a slate of people who were different than the ones we normally have? And there are studies have shown that if you have a diverse slate, you have a woman and 4 men, the probability of the woman being hired is 0. This was actually a study that was done at a university, but they actually did, if there were 2 women in the group out of 5, then the probability you would hire a woman was something like 40%, which would be the normal rate, right? And so it's really then looking at that data, you would go, hey, we did diverse slate for a long time. We brought in 1 woman and we're not hiring any of them. This university said, wait a minute, we're doing something wrong here. Let's look back and figure this out. And so I do think that data will tell us a lot of information. So unless that woman was just terrible, but that's not what happens. What happened was, when you brought in 2 women, you hired them at a much higher rate. So I think us kind of looking at the data, looking back, and then looking forward on how we make changes. How do we actually systematically change the way we think about things? That's going to be really important as well.
Okay, so you talk a lot about tools, and you mentioned sort of the screen for the orchestras, or the Rooney Rule, which comes from the NFL on making sure that at least 1 diverse candidate is interviewed for any head coaching position. And I know there's the Mansfield rule for the law firms. So there are different rules and tools, but from your experience, in Silicon Valley, whether it was at Ancestry or Facebook or eBay or PayPal, can you sort of talk about more specific tools that we can use to have a more diverse slate to make sure there's more participation? I know a lot of companies are trying to do blind interviews where HR removes the names and any pictures from the applicant pool, or start thinking about hiring folks that have no college degree for certain jobs. If you could just touch about some specific tools that other executives who are listening could say, okay, let's try this.
So, I'll tell you about my own experience, because I went through this. Okay. Where when I was at PayPal, 50% of our product team were women. And our leader, the vice president of product, Amy Clement, was a woman, and her directors. At one point, everyone sitting around her table, so the leads of every one of the groups, including myself, was a woman. And, I joined Facebook later, many years later. I joined eBay and I went to Facebook, and I looked around one day, and I actually had come in on the marketing side, so product marketing, not product. And so the non-technical side. And I looked around when I was moved over to product, and I realized that there were just so few women at the table. Like, where are all the women in product management, when previously it was 50% and all the leaders were women? And I was in for a wake-up call. And I wrote a little bit about this because I spent years trying to figure out, well, what happened? And so I wrote an article called What Happened in Women in Product, and I published it on LinkedIn. But what happened was along the way, and this happened industry-wide, it started with Google, where they required a computer science degree for product managers. So this is a really strong practical role. Product managers often decide what companies build and how they approach their roadmap, who we build for. And so at some point, Google felt like their product managers were not technical enough. And so they required a CS degree. Well, in America, 18% of the CS degrees are earned by women. And so what happened was a very diverse kind of group of people were now kind of narrowed down to whoever chose computer science. And suddenly you saw women just disappearing from the industry. So women who previously were successful, were managers, directors, senior directors, couldn't get their next job because they didn't even qualify. So they either had to stay at their company or leave. And we just saw a mass exodus of women, and we saw women never getting into the fields. And so when I got to Facebook, I looked around and I said, this is not what success looks like. And at one point we noticed that 3 of the most senior women, including myself, didn't have computer science degrees. And yet we were 3 very successful product managers. So at that point, I think we were like product VPs or product directors. And we said, wait a minute, we have this arbitrary rule that says we could never have actually entered this role. In fact, all 3 of us entered from different roles. We did not enter product directly. And so we said, wait a minute, what does that mean for us? And so by unpacking what was happening at the company and what happened industry-wide, we realized that having the CS degree requirement didn't necessarily make better product managers, since the people who snuck in clearly were, doing well, and yet, didn't meet the criteria. Second was, a technical interview was very intimidating if you didn't have a CS degree. So we removed the CS requirement, then we removed the technical interview. Then we looked at the interviews and we saw some interviews were correlated with long-term success and some were not. And so we removed those interviews, and we actually went and unpacked piece by piece over a long period of time. And we completely changed, revamped the way we did recruiting. And we brought in so many different candidates from very different walks of life, so many different backgrounds. And it actually changed the trajectory. And we brought, the quality of the product did not go down, and actually went up, because now we had people from different perspectives. And so, it was just one instant. It's like, it was one company, and it was what one company did. And then eventually I co-founded Women in Product, and we spread this through the industry, which was, how do we bring more women in, whether or not they have CS degrees? How do we remove technical interviews? How do we encourage more women from different backgrounds to pursue this field where it's a fulcrum of so many technical innovation happens in product?
Okay, well, that's good, because now we see that a brilliant engineer who majored in engineering at Duke, taking soil mechanics didn't disqualify you from putting out e-commerce products. So that's a good thing. So, so that's a testament to the power of actually having different schools of thought, different backgrounds, and bringing different people together to create good products.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so then let's broaden this out a little bit then, from sort of Silicon Valley, which I guess in the popular press, you're always reading about Silicon Valley, right? And home of the startups, right? Where, Google, Facebook, eBay, PayPal, right? That's like 1 or 2 decades later from the startups. But when you read the studies about, who's getting funding in Silicon Valley, and what the angel investors are investing in, and what the VCs are investing in, there's a whole host of diversity issues there. Do you want to comment on that, coming from that part of the world there?
Yeah, I was doing some research for my book, and one of the things I found, I saw this article, and the title was "Women Founders Drastically Increase Their Share of VC Funding." It went from 2% to 3%.
Okay, well,
it's like a drastic increase from a small number to small number. And it said something like mixed teams were getting something like 15%. So mixed teams with a women founder, which means that something like over 80% of funding goes to all male teams. Mm-hmm. And, I was trying to unpack, are male teams so much better? And in fact, actually, women-led teams, or teams with women on them, actually outperform from a financial perspective. So the interesting part is, you would think, venture capitalists are cold, they're like cold calculating, we're going to calculate what the best return is for our fund. And yet we were funding, you're funding teams that are not very diverse for some reason. And, they looked into it, and it's because VCs themselves, 90% of VCs are men. And women VCs actually invest in twice as much as women founders. But there's a lot, if you actually unpack the entire pipeline, it's actually very, very complicated. So I know a lot of women founders, and they tell me stories of, one woman said, I tend to pitch to male VCs who have daughters because they want, and I said, yes, but most VCs are married to women. And they said, no, it's different. It's different between what they hope for their daughters is their daughters will one day get funding. Mm-hmm. And it's very different than their partners. And I just couldn't understand it. And there's been a bunch of studies that male VCs actually promote more women associates if they have daughters. And so, systematically, we've created a system that creates a tremendous amount of wealth, but yet women didn't have an ability to get into venture capital. And then thus women founders were less funded. And so there was a study from Sweden that talked about, this is Sweden, a very progressive country, and they actually had a VC fund that was sponsored by the government. And so, they had researchers come in and actually record their conversation and sit in on some of the conversations with the founders. And they found that even these very progressive VCs had very different criteria and questions for the male and female founders. And in fact, funded the men more, would speak more highly. Basically, it's the women are judged on performance and men on potential. It was exactly what they found, what the researchers found. The researchers wrote this paper and they just said, hey, look, this is what was happening behind closed doors. No one just sat in on a bunch of these pitch meetings and the discussion meetings. But unveiling that, I think a lot of women founders had always felt that this was happening, but could never prove it. And that study opened the door to say, you know what, we do treat people differently. Just like the women, playing in the orchestra. The music doesn't sound different from the violin from a woman or a man, but that we're judging with our eyes. And so, we're judging the data that these startup pitches are coming from, whether the pitcher is a woman or a man. And so, there's so much bias that's, subtly in the system. And again, until someone sat down and actually listened to hundreds of hours of VC pitches and the discussions, no one actually could acknowledge this was happening. But it was incredibly validating to a lot of founders that I know to say, you know what, that's exactly what happened to me.
Okay. So, all right. So we spent a lot of time talking about, the studies, the problems, the biases, the lack of diversity. And the studies you mentioned about, women founders, I think that same study has been done about women who lead mutual funds, women who lead Fortune 500 companies, so on and so forth. So then we've been talking about diversity for a long time, right? I've been practicing law for over 2 decades, and I know in the law, which in America is the least diverse profession. People don't realize that, right? So what new ways of thinking or new tools out of the box that we should be looking at or talking about or thinking about to tackle this very old problem? Because we've been talking about it for a long time. We've been having these conferences for a long time, right? And I'm sure you and I have paid the success tax where we're on these conferences talking about diversity, whereas our counterparts, do not have to take the time to do that, right? The success tax. So tell me, Deb, give me some new ways of thinking. It's a loaded question, I know, and I'm putting you on the spot, but that's what you get paid the big bucks for. So tell me, what are the new ways what should we be doing differently?
So I think so often we treat diversity like it's just good that companies should do. Mm-hmm. And instead, what if we said, hey, you could grow your company 10% faster, that every business owner, every GM, every business leader, we said, what if you just grew 10% faster than your competitors because you did this one thing? If I gave you the secret, I'm going to sell you the secret, I'm going to be a consultant, and you're going to grow 10% faster because you're doing something that's really different than everybody else. And they say, well, what is it? And we're like, hey, hire more diverse people, grow them, retain them, and give them a seat at the table. And you will do better as a company.
Oh,
I know it sounds really simple, right? So who's going to turn that down? But I think we've been turning it down for so long because the people don't have the tools. They're like, I don't understand what that means. I don't know what that, and it's really bringing more women onto your board, bringing more diverse voices, bringing, African-Americans, Hispanic leaders to the table to actually look at the business differently, looking at your opportunities differently. We often kind of sell to the kind of middle of the road, right? But what if we said, hey, there's a new opportunity, there's new markets you're not even touching because you're not connected with them. You're not hearing their voices at the table when you're having executive meetings and saying, hey, where do we want to grow next year? You can deepen where you are, 2%, or you can open up this whole new market you're not seeing today. And I think by bringing those voices to the table, you can build better products. One of the products I built was Facebook Marketplace. But the reason I thought Facebook Marketplace was so special is all of these moms were buying and selling on Facebook. And I was one of the few moms at the company. I was actually the only mom who's a product manager. And I could see these people buying and selling, and I kept pitching the idea, and everyone's like, no one buys anything on Facebook. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I have bought dozens of things. I sold dozens of things. This doesn't make any sense. But if you bring people who see things that other people don't see, you're bringing new opportunities to the company. The company today, Facebook has marketplaces, a billion people using the product worldwide every month. And in the beginning, everyone's like, why would anyone want to buy anything? And I'm like, but when you bring different voices to the table, when you bring people who are different, they will give you a different perspective on your business you never saw before. And that opens up new opportunities. And so, rather than saying, hey, check the box and do these things because it's good, what if we said, this is going to improve your bottom line, and here's how, and here's the toolkit you need to do it.
So Deb, I think that's your secret sauce in action, right? Diverse voices, diverse thoughts, successful product.
Yes, absolutely.
I definitely want to thank you for hanging out with us today and talking about diversity and inclusion in the innovation space and your experiences in Silicon Valley. And we wish you all the luck in the world in your new position, 4 months now into the new job at Ancestry as CEO. And again, thank you for your time, and I really appreciate you.
Thank you so much for inviting me.